Imagine waiting 2 weeks to know if you got a like or not, or a thumbs up. In the decades before the internet, people made comics, and we reached out to each other. What was it like? This is the Sequential Artists Workshop, and these are the 90s mini comics oral history archives. Come join us as we take a longer look at those analog days when communication was a lot slower, maybe more deliberate, maybe more reckless. Who knows? It was just different. Join us as we take a look and really notice how much things have changed. Come join us on the socials. Sometimes it's Comics Workshop, sometimes it's Saw Comics. Either way, come check us out and welcome.
Hi, everyone. This is our next episode in our 90s era mini comics oral history archives podcast. Today we are meeting with Jess Abel. Let's go ahead and jump right into it with starting with our introduction. Can you please say your name, the date, and where you are recording from?
My name is Jessica Abel, and I am recording from Philadelphia on September 3rd of 2024.
Nice. And what are some comics publications that you created or were a part of in the pre-internet era?
My main title is a book called Art Babe, and it was a self-published mini comic first for 4 issues. It wasn't mini, actually. It was 8.5 by 11. It's large. But I did that for 4 issues, and then I won a Xeric grant and did a 5th issue with the Xeric grant, and that was my first professionally published comic. And then Fantagraphics picked it up, and I did a second run, so another 4 issues with them. And it was an omnibus book. It was like a lot of short stories. It wasn't one thing. It was like a lot of different things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. And what are some locations you worked from during the 80s or 90s?
I'm from Chicago, so I was in Chicago until 97. And then Matt Madden and I moved to Mexico City together in 98. Yeah, I guess it was early 98 that I left Chicago. So 98 to 2000, we were in Mexico.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And how would you describe your comics work from then?
There's a lot of variety. And I mean, I had other mini comics as well, like other short things, but my primary interest was in like quotidian stories, sort of everyday stories about young people living their lives. Most of them were in Chicago, set in Chicago. But there was also some humor, a little bit of humor comics. And I also did a weird series in Art Babe of these kind of World War II era stories of the drawing was based on H.G. Peters' drawing from Wonder Woman, 1940s Wonder Woman. And there's this kind of mysterious and toxic black-haired woman who's the center of this thing, but the main character is a Steve Trevor stand-in who is obsessed with her, and she keeps disappearing and not being who he wants her to be. And
Yeah,
it's a very odd piece. But I did two or three of those, and I also did a number of. I was working off and on at the New City, which was a tabloid newspaper in Chicago. Where at the time they had a lot of comics in that paper. It was where Chris Ware started off with Acme Novelty. Linda Berry was being published there. Maybe she wasn't. She might have been in the Reader. Anyway, the Reader and the New City were the 2 free papers that were coming out in Chicago at the time. And Durf was there during the City. I think Kaz was in there, I want to say. Doing their weekly strips. And then the Reader had Linda Berry, Life in Hell by Matt Groening, and Zippy, among others. But so they had a series, not a series, but like a one-offs every once in a while of nonfiction reportage comics. And they hired me to do a number of those over a period of 3 or 4 years. And it was really because the New Yorker had started doing these short, and theirs were like a strip, like literally a strip, that were nonfiction, like, on the street kind of reporting comics.
Mm-hmm.
And Georges Colomb was the art director of the New City. And he hired me to do some of these comics. And so I did one that was at let's say, what was the first one? There was a book called Prozac Nation that everybody was like freaking out about. And I did a strip about a book signing with Elizabeth Wurtzel. I think that was the first. She was the author, and that was the first one. I did one about the Fireside Bowl, which was a bowling alley that doubled as a punk rock venue.
Mm-hmm.
I did one about this tradition of like going to have to eat at Waldorf room for the Christmas tree. Like it was
Mm-hmm.
it was like all kinds of different stuff. So I did those, and that was like in parallel with what I was doing in Art Babe. Like it was in the paper. It was not in my own magazine, in my own comic. And that led to me doing also for quite a number of years, actually. I did a back page comic for the University of Chicago alumni magazine that was also like on the spot reportage, like going different places at the university. That's where I went to school. So it was like, going back and investigating various things. So it was like kind of a big thing I did for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And really ended, it didn't end, but like I stopped doing the sort of so much of it by, I don't know, the early 2000s or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But that Fireside Bowl comic, which came out in 96 or something like that, 95, that is what Ira Glass clipped and saved in his file cabinet, that then he pulled it out at a planning meeting a couple years later for pledge drive giveaways.
Mm-hmm.
Because he always came up with wacky ideas, and he's like, well, how wacky did you do a comic book? And so he hired me to do Radio and Illustrated Guide, which was the floppy comic that led later to doing Out on the Wire, which is one of my big books that came out in 2015.
Awesome. All right. Well, that'll bring us into our comics production section. Can you tell us how you made your comics, what tools you used, etc.?
Well, it was really hard to find out like how to make comics back then. Like it was very difficult to find out anything about like how it's actually done. So I remember the very first comic I drew was when I was a freshman in college, and I drew it for a class. And a good friend of mine saw me using a micron or something, I don't know, and was like, oh, but like actual artists use this, and gave me her rapidograph
Mm-hmm.
to use for lettering or whatever. I remember I was lettering on like little, I didn't know how to letter, so I was like lettering on little strips of paper and gluing them on with rubber cement, It was a mess. And then in my college years, so as a high school student, I had been on the newspaper, and at the newspaper, it was a very like rigorous newspaper program at Evanston Township High School. And we did all the paste up for the newspaper. Like I was, one of the editors on the news department, and we would lay out our articles, and we had to count words, we had to count headline, spaces and stuff. So because it's not computerized, you had to know like exactly how much space it was going to take. And then you would send it to a company and I don't even know how the sending part happened. I think we gave them like, hard copy or something. But they would run it out on strips of photostat paper, like
Mm-hmm.
kind of plasticky paper, that were in strips, that were like the width of 2 columns or 1 column or whatever it was, right? And you would run it through a waxing machine, and that would put little bits of like hot wax on the back of the paper, and you would cut it out and you would stick it down on blue line grid paper, and you'd make the newspaper page, on a piece of paper, and then you'd send that to the printer and they would print it. They would go through that process. And so I understood about layout. Like I understood that it's certain space and that what's going to happen when the things face each other and like other kinds of stuff from that process. We learned stuff like tombstone headlines, like don't put 2 headlines sitting next to each other, or they're going to read across. So there's a lot of little things that kind of fed into my understanding of the technicalities of all of this stuff. And when I was in college, I became the editor of a comics anthology group that Ivan Brunetti was also in, actually. And who else? There were a bunch of people in it who, I've lost touch with, but John Scalzi was in it, actually, and he's a big sci-fi writer. Anyway, so the first issue, somebody else was in charge of all that and had, sort of put the group together. I joined the group, and then I kind of ended up being the editor in the second year and did 3 issues. And I blame nobody for this but myself, but I ended up doing them all myself. Like I didn't, not the comics, but like all the layout, all the everything else.
Yeah.
I kind of didn't know how to like get people to help me with this. So I was doing this paste up with rubber cement, not a waxing machine, but like on blue line paper, and like, getting photocopies and cutting them and printing them and putting them together, and then like getting it to the printer and, picking it up from the printer. And so a lot of that, using actual printers, like producing work for printers, was familiar to me. And so when I got into mini comics, it was like not that hard to figure out that part of it. What was hard was all the pens and inks and all that stuff. And so in this very early era, in the 80s, I don't even know what I did. I think what was I drawing with? I don't even know. I took art classes and stuff at college, so I was using something, pens and dip pens, maybe, I don't know. Yeah, I think I maybe had found like speedball nibs or something and was doing stuff with that. I don't know how I found out about any of it, but then somewhere in the last years of the 80s, first years of the 90s, there were like listserv things that people had for comics related interests. And there was one that was like, I forget what it was called, but it was like more on the technical, like more on the creator side. And so I remember copy pasting like people's posts about various tools and things into like a Word document or whatever, so I could hold on to it. And there was also a group called it was Comics at something, but it was like comics with an X. And that was a list of lots of people I still know, actually, who knew a lot about European comics and world comics, like what's going on in Japan, and like people were living all over the place. And so it was a really great place to learn about like what was going on in the comics world.
Yeah.
And so I was learning there. And then when did this happen? I'm trying to remember when this happened, but like how was I using? I'm thinking about the actual artwork and like trying to picture what I was using to make it, and I don't really remember. But at some point in there, around 90, I want to say 92 or something like that, I got to know Dan Clowes and the group of people who would hang out at Earwax Records. So it was Dan, Chris Ware, because this is when he still lived in Chicago, Terry Laban, Gary Lieb, 1 or 2 other people, Archer Pruitt. And I didn't really ever like hang out with them much, but I hung out with Dan like separately, and I know Terry pretty well. And Chris, like I'd see them sort of separately, but like I didn't go to their weekly thing there. But I remember going once, maybe the first time I went, and brought some artwork, which was probably for Art Babe #1, maybe it was art #2, I'm not really sure. And Dan was like, he was looking at the art, and I had been using a lettering nib, like a speedball nib, to ink. And I was influenced by Philip Bond in Deadline, because I was reading Deadline and Crisis in college, because I would pick it up at a newsstand my first year of college, I was in, it's not important, but anyway, it's a big huge newsstand, and they imported stuff. And so like I got these comics there, and I loved Philip Bond, so great. Still think he's so great. And Jamie Hewlett. And so I was looking at those things and then sort of trying to ink that way, kind of, and I was using lettering nibs and various things like that. And Dan was like, hey, check it out. He's using a lettering nib to draw. And I was like, so embarrassed. And I was like, what? He asked my tools and I showed him and whatever. He doesn't think he ever did this. He did do it, but it wasn't meant in a mean way at all. He wasn't trying to shame me or anything like that. And in fact, the following week, I was working as a waitress. He stopped into where I was working and bought me a little sack of like a little brown paper sack of nibs that were hunt number 22 nibs. And he's like, this is what Jaime Hernandez uses. And he was my hero. So I was like, okay. So I started using those. And then I was hanging out with my friend Alex Wald at one point a few years later, and he's watching me ink with a nib. And he's like, nibs are great. Nibs are fine. But if you want to be able to draw eyelashes on a butterfly, you got to use a brush. And so I started using a brush around then. And like by the time I was doing this, this was like mid to late 90s or something like that. It was like pretty early I started using a brush, actually. So I was using a brush a lot to ink line work and stuff like that, and got sort of more and more into very tight brush work and like using dry brush and other stuff like that, to the point where I was like driving myself insane and had to stop. And so when I finished the Art Babe run and started working on La Perdida, one of the things I did was do a bunch of kind of exercises to shake off the super tight brush work to learn how to do something looser and do something that was going to be more sketchy and faster and easier. And yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, can you tell us how you readied your comics for print?
Well, I mean, I did paste ups, like photocopy paste ups. There's a lot of fun stuff you could do back then too. There were a lot of, I was working at one point in the administration, just like as a, admin, like office person at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And while I was there, I took a class in offset printing. So I learned to prepare my own films and to like use this huge stat camera, use a film camera and stuff. So again, it was like leveling up that understanding of like how all these things actually work, which changes, how you think about it. And Rubber Blanket came out around then. And so I was looking at David Mazzucchelli's 2-color work in there, Discovering America, where it's like it's red and like teal, and it makes sort of a purple black together, just flat colors, no, and I was really interested in that. I was really interested in, old hand cut color separations from the 40s, like Wonder Woman comics, very influential in my early life. Bad color. Like I liked bad color. And Chris Ware he was doing a weekly comic in the New City, and in the New City, they would use black and 2 single colors every week for a long time. Like they stopped, by the time I stopped working with them, they were using full color, but like for a while it was like 3 colors, but they were weird colors. It was like black and like yellow and green or something this week, it was something. And Chris would hand cut separations for his strip every week at the New City offices. Like he would take his Acme Novelty originals. He had his stat guy. His stat guy would shoot them down to like print size. Swore by the stat guy. He was really good. It was, not easy to get good stats. And then he would do the overlays himself. So he would like, create acetate overlays with like Zipatone, and he knew how to do all the angles and everything because he'd grown up. His parents are, his father, I guess, owns a newspaper, I want to say. And so he grew up with printers. Like he grew up knowing how to print, like how printing works. And so he was able to do stuff like doing the proper angles so that it doesn't moire and all the stuff. But so he would hand cut separations in like green and yellow to like make his comics seem sort of full color-ish,
Yeah.
but they weren't. So that again, like all these things of like limited color palette, hand cut stuff, weird techniques and
Uh-huh.
access to, sort of all this old technology and stuff was all in the mix. And so I would do stuff um, like I did a strip one time for In These Times, which also used two colors like that.
Mhm.
And I used like blue and red, like David Mazzucchelli had, to do a strip that had that three color thing.
Yeah.
And I was doing that with these just overlays with like, you create it in like a pencil artwork, and you do an overlay and that's one color and an overlay that's another color. And then
Mhm.
give them those, not the line work, right?
Yeah.
And then I would do things like that and similar things where there was a photocopy shop on Milwaukee Avenue that had this machine, I think a couple of them actually, where you could swap out the toner cartridges
Mhm.
for different colors. So instead of black toner and just like CMYK, you could get like they had brown and they
Mhm.
had like navy blue and red, like not magenta but red.
Yeah.
And so I would create color separations for like postcards or special artwork or whatever that were for brown and blue or something.
Mhm.
And then go at some late night when they didn't mind swapping out the cartridges and get them to do all that. Um, so yeah, so I was playing with a lot of those things,
Mhm.
doing stuff with like photocopying dot screens in different colors.
Yeah.
And basically didn't do very much color printing, like color printing for a long time. I had a few illustration jobs that were in color, but mostly things were like in black and white or weird colors. Most of my work was in black and white. So black and white, it was just a matter of making photocopies to the proper size, making, double-sided paste ups, and then, running them and collating and the whole deal, which I'm sure you've heard a million times
Yeah.
in these interviews. What I did do, again, like I was interested in printmaking, I was interested in book binding and all this other stuff. So the first 4 Art Babe issues have hand bindings, and they're
Mhm.
all different, badly done, whatever, just kind of one's yarn and one's like, I don't know what. And they all had prints on the front. They had like some kind of handmade embellishment.
Mhm.
And the first one was a potato print, actually. So there's a bunch of different prints for the cover because, it's a potato. So there's only so
Mhm.
many you can do.
Yeah. Awesome. So that kind of answers as well, how you printed them. Do you remember how many of your first comics or your early comics that you would print, and maybe how that changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, my very first comics were these ones that were in this anthology at school, and those I think we probably published like 1,000 of them or something. We sold them for like a quarter on campus. And that was not the same thing, but that's where it started, I think.
Mhm.
Maybe 500, I don't know. It was a lot. We had too many. Got a box in the basement if anybody wants them. And then when I was starting the mini comics, my first one, I did my own, like I hadn't kind of thought of making my own magazine yet for some reason, even though I was reading all the Fantagraphics stuff and whatever. I wasn't quite aware of mini comics as I started making a mini comic. Like as a photocopy, like this is the final thing idea. But I must have known about it enough. I don't even remember. But so what happened is the summer after I graduated from college, Pete Bag put a letter in the back, which was like, win a date with Stinky, which was his disgusting character in the magazine that nobody would ever get near voluntarily. Um, and it was like, just write in a letter and tell me why you want to date with Stinky or something like that. So I wrote him a letter like, I make comics, blah, 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 and just, kind of crazy. And I won this date with Stinky. And so what that meant was that 2 things. One was he was coming to Chicago to the Chicago Comic-Con. This is not the one that there is now. It's like a different one from back then. And he's like, come out and meet me. I can draw you so I can put you in the comic.
Mhm.
Not creepy. We were at the Comic-Con. It was fine. Not that it wouldn't have been fine otherwise, but he wasn't trying to be weird. Is all I'm trying to say. And also he was going to, if I had something to plug, he was going to plug it in the back of Hate. And plugs, as you probably know from doing the series, are like, that's how things happened, right? Is like getting a little capsule review essentially in somebody else's comic or in Fact Sheet 5 or whatever. That's how things grew. And that's how people found out about stuff. And Pete's letters page, his plugs page was like very influential. Like everybody was reading Hate, and like he would have a long page full of stuff every time. And it was like everybody was paying attention to that. Everybody being the whatever 200 people who cared, but you know what I mean. And so I was like, oh, I guess I have to have a comic now. And so I started putting the book together. And I think I printed maybe 200 total of the first one. 200, 250, something like that.
Yeah.
Maybe in a couple batches. But I brought them to the Chicago Comic-Con, and that's when I gave them to him. And we all went out to dinner with Gary Groth and Eric Reynolds and maybe Robert Boyd too, but I don't know if he was there. And then Dan was there too. And so I gave one to Dan. That's when we met, and gave one to Gary. He promptly forgot that I ever existed until 5 years later, and I had his Eric grant. And he's like, where did you come from? And I'm like, all my comics are on your desk, dude, somewhere in there. They're in there. But Eric was really nice, and really like, he's been a great friend ever since. Like, he's just very supportive and engaged. And he was the head of the Comics Journal. And so I think he must have given it to Robert Boyd to review, because I wouldn't have thought of doing that. But there was review in the Comics Journal of the first issue. And that really caused a lot of interest. Like, people were very interested, and like, you know, things took off from there. In the small mini comics way. And so after that, I think the next two were probably, I want to say 500 I made. And the last one, I made 1,000. And it took me like so long to make them all, because you know, we have to collate them all and fold them. And they're, you know, like I said, they're big, they're not small, but then I also had to hand bind them all and do stamps on the front and the whole deal. I was ready to be done with that stuff. Yeah. And I mean, I had other comics too, other like things I was involved in, but I really didn't make many more mini comics until I was with Matt and we were in Mexico, and we did a bunch of little funny things there.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. Well, that'll bring us into our noticing and awareness section. Can you tell us when you first saw evidence of people making their own comics?
Like publishing their own comics, self-publishing?
Yeah.
I mean, I suppose it must have been in high school, because, you know, there was the black and white boom, and seeing people doing like that stuff. There was a lot of talk about how this was, you know, the new thing, self-publishing. It wasn't photocopied, but it was, you know, author driven. And that's contemporaneous with, you know, Mouse coming out and Dark Knight, and like this, you know, the first wave of Fifth Bang Pow, kids comics aren't for kids anymore, you know. And I was in high school, so it was, you know, really intersected with where I was at then. And then when I went to college, there was a great record store where I went to college the first year, and I found Love and Rockets there. I found Raw, Gary Panter, none of which is self-published, but it has that, you know, connection to that self-published thing. So somewhere around then, I must have been aware this was a thing. I wouldn't be surprised if there were, and there certainly were zines around. I'm like, you know, did I know about Fact Sheet 5 and stuff? No. But, you know, I was like I said, I was buying Deadline and Crisis at a newsstand. Again, like, not self-published, but it's small publishers and artist-driven, artist-owned work. And somewhere in there, I'm going to comic stores and I'm finding some things somewhere, you know, like it wasn't, like I said, when in 92, 91, 92, whenever that was, did the first Art Babe.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I didn't invent that. I got it from somewhere. I don't know. Like, I definitely was not fully aware of a comics scene, like a mini comics scene,
Uh-huh.
but nor was I coming up with some new genre whole cloth. So,
Yeah. Awesome. Can you tell us a story of getting a comic that surprised or inspired you?
um, yeah, well, there's several around that time. I mean, Jimbo in Paradise was one. It's Gary Panter's
Mhm.
oversized raw book, just so beautiful and crazy and funny and scary. It's just, you know, and really, that's I did a lot of stuff that was fairly experimental at that point, and I think there, those influences, a lot of those that came from Gary came from like that strain of comics,
Mhm.
and later on settled into a fairly straightforward kind of narrative style, but a lot of my earlier stuff, there's just a lot more experimental elements in it, and I think it really came from that. Um, so there's that, and two other things that occur to me, or I just remember certain comics I remember poring over, like just sitting with them and like looking at all the lines and trying to figure out how they did what they did. And there were a bunch, that were like that over time. I mean, Milk Kniff was that for me.
Mhm.
Like it was Terry and the Pirates. I just spent so much time trying to figure that out. Wonder Woman again, like H.G. Peter very specifically. Um, I grew up with a collection of that from Ms. Magazine,
Mhm.
the early 70s, and it was, very influential in like my aesthetic and what I liked. Um, Heck was an
Mhm.
anthology of underground cartoonists, alternative cartoonists, where I discovered a lot of different people, and it was really good. Mark Merrick was in there. It was like some other people. It's like
Mhm.
very, Lloyd Dangle, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And Julie Doucet, I think, was also that to a
Mhm.
certain extent, where just her visual imagination for texture and space and everything coming to life and all those things was really super engaging for me. I just really loved looking at her work.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, so do you remember when you first heard of or picked up an issue of Fact Sheet 5?
I'm never a huge Fact Sheet 5 reader.
Mhm.
I had some at some point. So no, I don't remember a specific encounter, but it was definitely something I was aware of that was kind of, but it wasn't the only thing, and it wasn't, it's now I look back and I'm like, that is an incredible resource, that thing,
Mhm.
it's so amazing. Um, but I wasn't actually out in the scene looking for lots of stuff to buy. Like I
Mhm.
think there were people who were like pouring through Fact Sheet 5 and like sending off,
Mhm.
envelopes and stuff. Really from the very beginning, I was much more like I would meet people in person, or I would trade comics with people. They'd send me something like, hey, do you want to trade? And I'd send something back. And I wasn't like in a super exploratory phase through the mail
Mhm.
for the most part.
Yeah.
So
Awesome.
yeah, I didn't use it that much.
Cool. Um, so did you ever, I know you mentioned that you said that you were mostly like meeting people in person. Did you ever get your work reviewed in any of these?
Yeah. Yeah, lots. I mean, yeah, it was really interesting because like I said, it started with Comics Journal and everybody read the Comics Journal.
Hmm.
And then, I got like little blurbs and plugs and things kind of all over the place. And it didn't feel hard. Like that didn't feel difficult to
Hmm.
get things seen like that. Because everybody was like, trying to be the person who shared,
Hmm.
here's what's happening and here's what's going on. And I ended up also with, I want to say 10 or 15 like retail accounts
Hmm.
around the country,
Awesome.
where almost all of them reached out to me, found me and
Hmm.
said, can we carry your book?
Yeah.
And I would do, I would send them 5 or 10. They send me a check, so like I had comics like in stores
Yeah.
actually. Um, really great people, really great people who are like absolutely committed to the whole, you know, the whole scene, like the whole thing. Actually, and one thing I should point out is Quimby's is in Chicago,
Mhm.
and Quimby's is, heart and soul, like zines and comics and stuff.
Yeah.
And I don't remember when they opened, but it was early 90s.
Mhm.
And so that's a huge part too of just being like, this is just a thing. This is just a thing that's happening. Like I didn't have to like go out of my way
Mhm.
to find stuff because Chicago Comics was there and they were always really good. And they weren't the same thing then. Now it's the same company, right? Eric Kersmer bought Quimby's when Steven Svimbersky left and he lived in Amsterdam for many years. But before that, they were friends, but they were
Mhm.
two separate stores and both really good, both, you know, covering like Chicago Comics much more like the alternative comic scene, less zines and minis, but some.
Mhm.
And then Quimby's was just like deep in the
Yeah.
everything self-published.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Well, that'll bring us into our community section then. Can you tell us the story of how you met your closest friend or peer in comics?
You mean Tom Hart? And my closest friend or peer in comics would be my husband, Matt Madden.
Mhm.
And I met him because of comics. I met a lot of people in comics early and easily because I lived in Chicago.
Mhm.
And also because I'm a fairly comfortable person with people. Like I can
Mhm.
just, I like to go out, I like to do stuff, I like to meet people. I'm not super extroverted, but I'm like okay
Yeah.
in crowds. And that puts me ahead of like 95% of cartoonists. And, so I can just kind of show up and be like, hey, what's going on?
Mhm.
Um, and so the Chicago Comic-Con, the old one was a very like sort of city focused, scene focused, local kind of thing. It was big, but it was, that. And uh, through family connections, I met some people who were involved in like Vertigo and other stuff like that. So I like knew some of those people. And then I met, um, a little later, I met Pete and Dan and all the Fantagraphics crew that way. But then locally, then you have these stores and scenes and like, I worked there was a store called Haley's Comics, which was also a really good store. And
Mhm.
my job as a bartender soon after I graduated from college was at a bar across the street from Haley's. And all the Haley's guys and like their regulars would come over and hang out at the bar. And this was like top fans as well as artists.
Mhm.
And kind of meeting all those guys. I helped organize one of the SPX comes out of a tour of self-published artists
Mhm.
that was in 93, 94, something like that.
Mhm.
This was who was doing it? It was Jeff Smith,
Mhm.
and I think it was the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles guys
Mhm.
and Linda Medley or something, and like Charles, what's his name? Did the fantasy comics? I'm forgetting his name. Anyway, they had it was called Spirits of Independence,
Mhm.
and they had tour stops, like little conferences, and they would go someplace, and then other people could come and set up tables. It was like had conference room or whatever at
Yeah.
a hotel, and they were the big draws, and then there would be these other little tables around, and so that's the first SPX was that the
Mhm.
Spirits of Independence, and then there was a Chicago stop that then became, for 1 year there was an independent comics festival in Chicago.
Yeah.
Maybe a new one now, I don't know, but there was then. in, I want to say 95 or 96 or something like that. And I was like on the committee for that. And so like meeting all the people there and going out to, I was at the second year of SPX. I went out to Ape, like I would go to these festivals and conferences and things. And so by the early 90s, had a number of different things I would do, and people I knew. I was in the music scene in Chicago, so I knew a lot of people through that. And so with Matt, and I met Tom, I think maybe before I met Matt, I'm not even sure, but like with Matt, the two of us were both in a couple times in Tower Records magazine, Pulse, Mark Wiedenbaum's editorial fiefdom. And at one point, and we knew each other through exchanging comics, like we traded comics for a few years, but had never met, and almost met a couple times, like,
Yeah.
I wanted to meet Jessica. Oh, she just went to the bathroom, like that kind of thing. But then I did a comic in Pulse magazine in 1995, and he found my email and wrote me and said it was really great, and he really liked it. And then we started an email correspondence, and then that turned into an email romance because he was living in Austin and I was in Chicago. And then that was like 96-ish when that all happened. And then 97 was the year we got together. And then 98, we moved to Mexico, and we're still together. So
Yeah, that's awesome.
yeah.
That's great. All right. Can you tell us about the first con or show situation where there were other people doing what you did that you attended?
Probably not, no. It was somewhere in there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, what was the first time I had a table? Maybe might have been the first SPX. I mean, again, I was not at the first one because the first one was the Spirits of Independence, but I was at the second one.
Yeah.
Might have been that where I had a table.
Yeah.
I have a photograph of myself at the Chicago Comic-Con in 1996, sitting next to Will Eisner. So
Wow. Yeah.
yeah. But I was at Chicago Comics table. They invited me to come in with my minis and stuff and sign stuff. It's really nice of them.
Yeah, that's awesome. All right. Can you tell us when you felt the most connected to the community or the least connected or both?
I mean, that whole period through the mid 90s was like, it was, it was all this, like, it was everything we were doing, and like I would say 94 to 97 or something. And after that too, but like at that point we'd left the country, so we weren't going to as many things. Or earlier even, like, I don't know, the whole like early 90s period, it felt like it's like a lot is happening. I, made a lot of friends. It was easy to make friends. I had a lot of time for my work, and struggled with procrastination and so on. But, when I look back, I realized how much I was experimenting and how many different things I was getting into. And, comics is lonely in general. Like, you spend a lot of time by yourself.
Yeah.
And I've never loved that about it, and like being an author of any kind, you spend months or years creating something before anybody ever sees it. And one of the nice things about minis is that you can publish little bits of things and people can respond. You can have more of a feel like you're alive.
Yeah.
like your work is alive between things. So that was all, I think. I mean, there are ups and downs and, like, things that happened that weren't awesome, but for the most part, it was a good feeling of connection, and, feeling like there was a lot there throughout that whole period. And probably in the mid 2000s was when I felt least, not even really, but like there's certain years where like I was slogging away on a book. Nothing had been out for a really long time. I wasn't getting to any conferences or doing any things. There was no, like various kinds of things started happening less, and didn't really know what my work was supposed to look like or what I wanted to be doing anymore, and sort of lost the thread of, the stuff that I did through my early to mid 20s was I mean, a lot of it's, I'm proud of it. It's very like, there's a lot of really heartfelt stuff. I think there's some really nice drawings, some good scenes and, character development, like lots of things I can be proud of. But the whole overall project of Art Babe was just extremely snotty, like
Yeah.
very kind of, punk rock in your face, like da 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 da, look at me, this is the thing. And then at some point I grew a frontal lobe and kind of didn't want to do that anymore exactly that way, right? And then I was like, well, how do I transition into more of an adult relationship with my work, rather than post-adolescent, in a way that, I mean, again, I'm not ashamed of any of that stuff. It just didn't feel right anymore, Um, and so that whole transition into, what am I going to be as a grown-up was pretty difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's something that most artists can probably relate to.
Yeah. I mean, you have to figure out a new place to land. Like, what are you now?
Yeah.
And I really like, uh, my late 30s, early 40s were tough that way. I had like small children and, just kind of didn't know what I was like, what did I want to make anymore? I was doing teaching and textbooks and all this stuff. And it was very demanding. So
Yeah. Okay. Well, can you say who were / are your most significant peers in comics?
well, that's a rough one, isn't it? Significant in what way?
Significant in maybe how they impacted you as an artist.
Well, Matt would be number one, just somebody who has been there and like had conversations with me that are very engaged and specific. It was one of the nicest things about having a relationship with another cartoonist, and one who's very sort of thinking cerebral, is like, we can get in the weeds, and nobody's like checking out on this conversation. And so that was pretty cool.
Yeah.
And Tom Hart has actually been very influential for me, just in terms of thinking about engagement with the art form. And also, like, when he went off and started Saw, it was like this, I just had this angle on education and teaching that I thought was super interesting. And I taught with him, like we co-taught courses more than once, and just really like his teaching style and everything. So that was really great. And love how inventive he is. And it just, in terms of influence on me, in terms of style, or in terms of like the work itself, and peers in terms of age, there's not a ton, because people, I was really being influenced by people who are older or a lot older.
Yeah.
In terms of art style and so on. I mean, Jaime Hernandez was like huge influence on me, and that influence remains important. And weird things too, like people who wouldn't necessarily like identify, but the way that I did my book Out on the Wire, which comes from the way I did my book Radio and Illustrated Guide, comes from Scott McCloud. And it wasn't something that I would be like, hey, look, I'm doing Scott McCloud, but like, just picking up little bits and pieces here and there.
Yeah.
Another person who was really important to me through the 2000s was Nick Bertozzi. Again, like really smart person, really good to talk to, all of these things about. And, lots of other artists who I was looking at, but not people who were like Nick and Tom and Jason Little and us and their spouses. Like we were all like a group kind of, and like would see each other a lot. But then there are all these other people who are like, in the orbit. David Mazzucchelli became a friend, and he's really, Gary Panter, as I said, like, but they're not like in that inner circle. So I don't know how to quite answer that question.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. Did you ever do like collaborations or like draw jams with them or those people in your circle?
I did one time. I wasn't super interested in jam drawing and stuff. One time, Matt and I did a collaboration with a bunch of different people around the country. for the New Art Examiner.
Mhm.
New Art Examiner, I think. Art Forum. No, New Art Examiner. It was an art magazine. Yeah, it must have been New Art Examiner. Anyway, it was like we and Tom Devlin had a conversation and recorded this conversation about, like, we called it Wither Comics, like what's happening in the comics world.
Mhm.
And then we created a script out of it, and we sent out that script to 4 different teams. Like, we were one, and there was 3 different teams, and it was like, it was Megan Kelso leading a group out in Seattle.
Mhm.
I think Dave Lasky might have been in that. I don't even know. And then there was the Rhode Island, like the Providence crowd,
Mhm.
uh, did one page, and somebody else did another. I can't remember, but it was a weirdo project. It was very fraught by the end.
Yeah. Awesome.
Yeah.
How would you say that your peers and those around you impacted or affected your work?
I mean, I think the most important thing is that it's a way to keep going.
Mhm.
You know, if you know other people who are doing it, I don't think that most of the people I knew, I mean, I mentioned Megan Kelso and like Jason Lutz and, like, people who are living far away, um, also are good friends and people who I was influenced by in certain ways. But it's like, it's, there aren't, there weren't a lot of people in my immediate, like, age cohort
Mhm.
who were doing work that I felt like was super similar to mine.
Yeah.
Um, Although from the outside, probably people are like, oh yeah, it's all the same. I don't know, but like in the interior, I was like, it's not, we're doing different things.
Mhm.
There was a period when there were a lot of people doing, like, pre-autobio boom.
Mhm.
People are doing a lot of, like, sort of fiction the way I was.
Yeah.
But then I really stuck with fiction.
Mhm.
And a lot of people who I knew were doing, either they were heading off into other realms of fiction, or they were doing more autobio memoir
Mhm.
stuff. And I really never did that. People thought I did. They thought stuff I was doing was autobiographical, but it wasn't. um, and So the way in which I think my cohort influenced me is that we were all doing stuff. You would see people, you would, find their new work and, see how cool it was and talk to them about it. They would, compliment you on yours or be excited about what you're doing. And again, it's a lonely field. So that's super important.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay. Well, that'll bring us into our second to last section. This is our distribution section. You mentioned that you often met with people in person. So can you tell us about how you would trade or sell your comics?
Well, I had a PO box, and people would send me $2 or whatever in an envelope, and I would send them a comic. So
Mhm.
that's the main way things would happen. And so I had a large collection of, like, recycled envelopes, and I would just, had a sort of like mail station, and I would just reuse everything and send it
Mhm.
out. Very close, very close and heartfelt relationship with my PO box. And then as I said, I did do trades. I had people I did trades with.
Mhm.
I didn't trade with everybody who asked me, but I traded with lots of people.
Mhm.
And so they'd send me their latest thing. I'd send them my latest thing. It wasn't like a one-to-one trade. It's like you had a list and you'd send people when you did a new thing.
Mhm.
And then, so like a comp list, essentially.
Yeah.
And then, as I said, I had a number of stores that carried my comics,
Mhm.
and I had some that were consignment, but most of them would just buy it outright, fortunately, because it's a lot of work to maintain consignment across the country.
Mhm.
And a couple catalogs, like, what's the San Francisco one called again? I don't remember. Anyway, there's, a couple of catalogs would carry the book. And yeah, tabling at conventions.
Yeah. Cool. Do you remember any of the comics that like come to mind of some that maybe got traded with you or that you bought or picked up?
I mean, lots of the people I mentioned, I would
Uh-huh.
be trading with them. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Did you feel, you mentioned Quimby's in Chicago. Did you feel connected to any other particular stores or venues that supported you and your community?
Yeah, I mean, Chicago Comics was
Mhm.
major. I mean, that's a really like Eric and his manager at the time, Kurt, were like really good friends and
Mhm.
super supportive. And I was probably more connected to them than Quimby's actually, because while I like Steven, I was really interested in what was happening in the alt comics world, and
Mhm.
Chicago Comics had like more of that stuff.
Yeah.
Although Quimby's was really close to my house, so that was also an advantage. But then, outside Chicago, like Million Year Picnic was really important. It was carried by, I'm not gonna remember all the names, but like there was a store in Portland, um, I think it's still there, that carried my books, and Meltdown in LA, and like there's a bunch of like sort of key places around the
Mhm.
country. And interestingly, I think, there's been all kinds of changes in the retail scene, but I think, when you had stores like that that were really proactive, engaged, supportive, a lot of them still exist,
Mhm.
that they haven't, unlike stores that just kind of like catered to the, Thursday box crowd or whatever,
Mhm.
um, which nothing wrong with that, but like that can only be part of your business. Like if
Yeah.
that's your whole business, like it's pretty weak, right? So
Mhm.
um, I think it's telling, not all of them, some of, like Green Brain and whatever, some of them have, and Green Brain and Big Brain, both gone.
Mhm.
But they're, a lot of these stores are still doing well, at
Yeah.
least there.
Yeah. Awesome. Um, were you ever a part of any kind of distribution collective like Puppy Toss or submit to any of the distributors like Phantom House?
I mean, my books have been carried by some of them, but
Mhm.
usually they'd reach out to me, and I
Yeah.
wasn't like part of the collective, but
Mhm.
they carried it. And so there was a few different, there was one that I'm going to forget the details of, where the guy was like actually, and it was in Cambridge. It was like Million Year Picnic adjacent or something
Mhm.
in that area. But he would actually print the comics. Like I would send masters and he would
Mhm.
print and fulfill. And I feel like Tom Devlin was involved with that, but I'm not really sure. Um, some other things like that. Yeah. So a bunch of different things like that over
Yeah.
time. And my one thing that I thought was kind of interesting, and I don't, this is adjacent to mini comics, it's not the same thing, but like the Zarek grant,
Mhm.
Peter Laird's mission with the Zarek grant wasn't to support people to make comics, it was to support people to publish comics.
Mhm.
And so the grant was structured so that you could get money for printing,
Mhm.
distribution, and marketing.
Mhm.
I understood printing, but I think a lot of people just were like printing and didn't really kind of get the rest of it.
Mhm.
So that was the one time I've gone through the myself personally gone through the comics distribution system
Mhm.
was for that book.
Yeah.
Um, like not with a publisher, but like independently.
Mhm.
So I was in the very last Capital City catalog before it
Mhm.
collapsed, and in Diamond. And I had a thing where I sent out, I have all these like ephemera from this, but I like created these postcards and I sent them out. I paid somebody, maybe Capital, to send out postcards to all of their accounts
Mhm.
saying like, do you want free posters? So if you order my book, I will send you free posters, like a free poster if you're like make an order. And I
Uh-huh.
got these orders from these stores. I wasn't fulfilling. I mean, they were sent, it was
Yeah.
Capital, it was like selling things, but then I got their names and I would send them these posters that I made at the um, uh, offset printing lab
Uh-huh.
at SAIC. And so I did that. So I made those posters. I had this whole kind of like promo scheme thing, but like
Mhm.
this weird, it was like, self-distro adjacent. Like I was the publisher, but then I had to figure out how do I get to these stores directly, to retailers directly.
Yeah.
But I was really interested in that whole retail angle for a
Yeah.
while. I did at that Chicago Comic Con that I talked about that I helped organize, like on the committee or whatever. One of the pieces that I was in charge of was we had like an indie retailer roundtable on Sunday. It was like a Saturday festival thing, and we had like a brunch
Mhm.
and already talked about the problem of getting better comics into comic stores. A bunch of comic store owners came and some artists. So
Yeah, that's awesome. That's cool insight into the Zurich grant. All right, so that'll bring us into our wrap-up section. Can you tell us what you miss about that time?
um I mean, I miss the conventions and events and various kinds of things like that were there then, because they were full of my friends. And I was at SPX basically every year for the first 10, 15 years, like a long time, and then haven't been for quite a while, because at some point I was like, I don't really know many people. I mean, I knew a lot of people, but there like everything kind of had changed in terms of the vibe of the scene, and I felt like what I was doing didn't really fit tabling anymore. So I stopped tabling and I would just go. And then it just, it didn't have the same kind of feel anymore. And that's me changing. It's the scene changing. It's everything at the same time. So, little, nostalgia for youth, I guess.
Yeah.
I miss PO boxes and mail. I have a PO box now. Nothing's ever arrived in it.
Yeah.
I don't really tell anybody about it, so it's not really a big deal. I have it for business purposes, Yeah, I mean, I get nothing in the mail anymore. Like, mail is so boring, and digital things are so boring. Everything's sort of flattened into one format.
Yeah.
And I mean, I got a lot of crap in my mailbox too. Believe me, there's plenty of stuff that just is not worth sending through the mail. But it was just, there was always something, and it was
Yeah.
like to discover. I miss tabloid newspapers. I
Yeah.
miss free newspapers, which like something to do other than look at a screen. I didn't, it's not like I read them cover to cover, but there was, like, we live in Philadelphia now, and Matt's commented before that there's nowhere to find out what all the movies are that are on in town.
Yeah.
Really, there's no one place, there's no place, so there's people like, there's university theaters and there's independent theaters and there's, film groups and whatever, but nobody's writing it all up and there's no listing. It's bananas. Like,
Yeah.
I don't know, like, we've lost so much information about not just, I mean, comics are one thing, but like just what's happening in your town. Everything's so nationalized, and oh, find us on Instagram and then never find us again. Like, there's no way to find stuff anymore.
Yeah.
Really, ironically, because you can find anything. There's no way, there's nobody's curating, bringing this stuff together. There's no kind of easy way in to what's happening locally.
Yeah.
Never mind the work that's been lost, but the local focus and on multiple levels, at a journalistic level, but also just like ads, literally ads.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Is there anything you don't miss about that time?
There are a lot of things I don't miss at that time, but we don't need to go down that road.
All right. Well, with that, our final question would be, can you tell us 3 people we should contact for these archives?
There's a lot of people who I'm sure are on your list who are pretty obvious. Have you talked to Lloyd Dangle?
Not yet. We're trying to find contact for that.
Yeah, I think he'd be good. He'd be interesting. And a lot of people I know are saying the same people Tom would know. So I'm trying to think if there's anybody like outside that circle. It'd be good to get people in from like the San Francisco scene too.
Mhm.
And I'm sure you are, but like the people who are behind Ape or
Mhm.
Last Gasp, that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. Um, and of course the Detroit scene.
Mhm.
Yeah. Trying to think if there's anything out there. Yeah, I'm sure your list is pretty complete as far as we have a lot of overlap.
Yeah. All right. Well then that'll conclude our interview. Do you have any final thoughts?
No, I think it's great you're doing this. It's really, I think it was an interesting and very pivotal period in comics history. And I'm glad that you are trying to reach out and preserve a lot of that information.
Yeah.
I'm glad I was there. So
Yeah. All right. Well, that'll complete our interview then. Where can people find you if they'd like to see more of your stuff?
well, they can find me at jessicaabel.com, but they're not going to see a lot of my stuff there because now I'm a coach for creatives. I do business coaching and coaching for projects and stuff like that. So that's mostly what's on my website, although my books are there. But if you want to see my comics and my mini comics especially, I've donated a whole bunch of stuff to the Billie Ireland collection. And a lot of that is like you can find out what's there at least online. Like you can like search me and find out all this stuff.
Yeah.
They have like one of everything. They have tons of my stuff. I gave them
Yeah.
a whole bunch of boxes. So um if anybody happens to be that interested, they can go there.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for watching or listening. And yeah, that'll conclude this episode.
Thanks.
Thanks for joining us. This has been a production of the Sequential Artists Workshop, or SAW. You can find us on social media at Comics Workshop and online at sawcomics.org. You can hear about our many courses at learn.sawcomics.org. SAW is a nonprofit and supported by people like you. Learn how to make a tax-deductible donation at the donate page of sawcomics.org. You can join our free community of comics explorers at members.sawcomics.org. Thanks so much for being here.